no huge expectations, just want to chat. And appreciate you coming. Tell me a little bit about yourself. Like, what do you do for Speakeasy? And tell me a little bit about your background.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I joined Speakeasy not long ago, a couple months, 4 or 5 months. And I'm a product engineer, as many of us are at Speakeasy. And at Speakeasy, we build what I believe very subjectively to be the best SDKs, generated SDKs, um, among various other things. And this is kind of what brought me here right now, because we recently released our agent skills. And agent skills kind of sort of the direction that we want to take the product in terms of how people interface with Speakeasy. As you may or may not know, right now it's a CLI, and the primary way you would interact with it would be through prompts in the CLI itself. And what we found is that a lot of the times we will run the same exact workflow over and over again to diagnose customer issues, and that's where the idea of uh, hey, why don't we outsource it to Claude? Why don't we outsource it to coding agents and create a repository of documentation that can then be consumed by our customers as kind of like the front line.
Yeah, there's several things there I want to kind of set the stage for and unpack is so first off, like one of the things I'm trying to get a handle on right now is kind of the shift in the SDK kind of client. I spent 4 years at Postman helping build Postman, so very familiar at the client level, but done a lot of work on SDKs, both kind of generated from OpenAPI, which you guys are kind of leading the conversation or have been for a while now. And then also dynamic SDKs, so you guys, so you can choose what you want. So kind of I would say the precursor to kind of context engineering is how do you just create an SDK for what you need? And I, help I've done a lot of work with like Kyoto from Microsoft, Appomatic. I help build a lot of what they do and around API Transformer. And so I'm really keen on the how you see, you mentioned the shift in being, CLI skills, Claude, which speaks to IDE slash copilots for me. So I'd love to get your thoughts on just where things are going from a developer perspective when it comes to SDKs, clients, CLI, IDE, copilots, all of that.
Yeah, definitely. Very broad topic. Um, yeah, I would say right now the execution angle seems to be evolving around coding agents such as Claude, for example. I would mention Claude because it's mainly what we use. But there's also others. Codex stands out as another one. We find most software engineers nowadays shifted really quickly from using their IDEs to develop software to concocting all these plans and like having them be executed by a coding agent. And through this, we found um, the value proposition of having a way to consume your API becomes more and more valuable. One of the key parts that these coding agents do somewhat well, but also can make mistakes on, and these are the most costly mistakes sometimes, is interfacing with your between your existing system parts. Um, One example that comes to mind, this was just a couple of days ago, Cloudflare had an outage that was caused by um, basically a mismatch between the client expectations and the API contract. This is stuff that LLMs still get wrong all the time. And this is where something like Speakeasy SDK generation would help because it's fully deterministic. You get the same output every single time. It's reliable. It's been battle tested for years and years. And we constantly work on improving it and making sure that it's as usable as possible. Another thing that you mentioned there was sort of the idea of skills and how we interface with skills. Um, so for context, skills, agent skills are kind of these code snippets or like these like text snippets that you can inject on demand into the context. So when you're dealing with something like Claude, for example, Claude has a tool called skill. And that tool, what it does is in Claude's initial context, it will have like a very tiny snippet. It's only a couple hundred tokens, and it will have like a list of available skills, which is just a name and then a short description of what it does. Description is a bit of a misnomer here, and I'll get to that in a second. But essentially, Claude, during its regular execution, it might or might not choose to execute a skill tool. And when it does so, essentially all it does is it will walk the file system, find the skill, and then it will just basically spit it into context, which is nice because all of a sudden you augmented Claude with all this new information. And the way this can be best utilized is if, for example, if you have some very specific task that requires repetitive instructions, if you find yourself constantly having to say, do X, like run tests once you finished X, that might be a good use case for a skill, because essentially what you want is the agent to figure that out itself. So you give it a slight bit of steering. In it will always, rather you adding it to the context so that it's there all the time, you get to just pick for it to activate on demand, which is where the value comes from. So how we got into skills, our CEO Sagar actually opened the first PR, which shout outs to him, by the way. I love the fact that he sort of leads the charge in especially adopting new technology. He opened the first PR into adding agent skills, and that was our first iteration. It's kind of like, what's our entry point into SDK generation, and that was a couple of skills, stuff like how do you tweak your OpenAPI spec to be more compliant with us, or like more suitable for SDK generation. Another skill would be how to get started with SDK generation, right? So like what commands to run, how to install the Speakeasy CLI, and then what output to expect. So stuff like this that is a common setup, which we feel like is obviously very useful if you run a coding agent and you just ask the coding agent, hey, give me an SDK, I have my spec here. The thought process there is it would, given you installed Speakeasy agent skills, you would then be able to, the coding agent would then be able to pick up the relevant ones and give you better outcomes, more focused outcomes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I mean, there's two important dimensions there. I don't think a lot of folks think about is when you're using an API, you tend to have an open API, you tend to generate SDKs, and you generate clients for people to onboard with your API and use it. Now, what Speakeasy is doing is at another level also. You guys are enabling that. You are a service API service provider who enables people to do that. But what you're offering is a menu of what Speakeasy offers, which has long been there. I mean, you guys have your own API and own open API, which is kind of that menu of what you guys do. And that's always been one of my biggest beefs with API service providers is they tend to have some of the worst APIs. Not the case with you guys. You guys, understand, I would say SDK generation is the most difficult kind of stop along the API lifecycle, and you can't mess around. You got to know your stuff to be able to do it, and you got to have a good API. And so you guys are offering the menu. So can you talk about the relationship between Open API at both of these levels, either of these levels, and skills and the quality? Because I know you guys have been leading generating MCP kind of context windows in a similar way. Can you talk about the relationship between Open API and skills?
Yes, definitely. So like I said, one of the first features, one of the first skills that we actually launched is a skill that helps you customize your OpenAPI spec to be, I want to say, more compliant. Obviously, one of our goals is that any spec you give us, as long as it's valid, as long as we can parse it, we should be able to give you some form of SDK from it. But there are some optimizations that you can make uh, within your spec that will give you better outcomes, such as better names for methods, pagination, stuff that we would enable through our like custom annotations, but also some stuff that's kind of like organizational. For example, just separate your endpoints into their own distinct sort of tags and like better structure your open API. A lot of these workflows, the blocker is often the fact that it's so easy to give advice, and even an agent, coding agent, would probably be able to take your open API spec and go, oh, cool, let me just customize these things. And you'd probably get a good outcome. The underlying problem is most of these specs we find are actually generated from code, right? So a lot of times people would set up something like Fast API, and they would then have the OpenAPI spec be generated from their endpoints, which is cool. It's quite a seamless process, but unfortunate side effect of this is that those specs are often not the most refined, not the best to work with, and unfortunately, that will also then end up to giving you a lower resolution SDK, right? It will be less refined. There's only so much information we can work with, and ultimately, you lose a bit of resolution at each generation step. And if you think about it, when your input source is already generated, there is only so much we can do. So one of the things that you could do is you could run an AI agent on it, and each time you regenerate from your API, you regenerate your spec, you could then apply these suggestions to it. But the problem is, then it becomes a non-deterministic process, right? Because all of a sudden it depends on what model you run, what time of the day it is, like what the temperature setting was, what if Anthropic rolled out a new change or they throttled one of their models, you'd get all sorts of different outcomes. And then you'd have a different SDK every single generation, which again isn't ideal. So the solution to that is we use overlays, which is an open API specification. So we use overlays as like a first-class citizen in our system. We will apply, you can add an arbitrary amount of overlays, and then we will apply them during generation so that you can enhance your spec. You can even like remove bits, you can move bits, you can copy bits from your spec to better organize it, basically give you a bit of a dynamic way of interacting with your spec before it gets to this generation stage. But unfortunately, the flip side of that is obviously like these overlays are like a bit complicated to work with. It's something that an agent is very, quick at figuring out how to do, but a human might take a bunch of time to like find the correct filters and like, figure out like what layer of the YAML document indentation do I need to get into, etc., etc. So it is a bit of a tedious piece of work, especially if you're a human doing it. But what we found is coding agents are quite good at figuring this sort of stuff out. So one of our main skills that we use us internally as well is the overlay skill and how to solve specific problems by applying overlays. So like, for example, a quick one that I can give you that actually we had a feature for a long time is generate better names for your methods. And the way that would work is you can just apply a name override annotation to each operation, and that would give you slightly more easier to work with operation name. Obviously, your operation ID needs to be unique, but it doesn't mean that your methods need to be unique, right? So you could have something like API .pets .list, right? But you don't need to change your operation ID to list. So that would be an operation that we would often do, and in fact, we have our own like for a long time we had our own even before way before my time we had this like AI enhanced workflow to give you better names, and this was done through Overview. But we found that there's also like an endless possibility of improvements that you can make this way. So why don't we just, open up the stage for everyone to figure out what they want to improve, run their own models, create their own overlays. Their spec can remain in whatever state they want it to be, and the overlays will apply on each generation. So you actually have this deterministic incremental enhancement to each generation.
Wow, yeah, that's beautiful. I would say you guys demonstrate a kind of mastery of the specs, open API overlays, and I'm sure you guys are working with Erazo as well. But it sounds like you guys are really embracing the goal-based, actual intent. Agentic is not necessarily work pre-described workflows. They're goal-based, and you guys are kind of leaning in on the skills piece. But I think and you guys have the whole governance and kind of, SDKs being the hardest one you got to generate from. And then you guys have the governance and the spectral and the linting and you got the overlay. So you got this like nice balance between deterministic and non-deterministic. And you're really testing, well, what's AI good at? What's the scheme, what's needed for schema, what's needed for human. You guys seem to be finding that balance. And when I went through your skills, what really caught my attention is the overall folder structure of how you guys created your skills. And I kind of see that next generation of artifacts similar to OpenAPI overlays, async API, JSON schema. I see Claude MD, Rules MD, Gemini MD, Copilot instructions, skills, and agents. So can you talk a little bit about like the thinking that went in behind, that and learning? Did you guys, just see what's out there, the best, did you take your own practices and how you guys developed? Did you guys take what you saw in the space? Like, how did you guys come up with that list?
Yes, actually, I'm going to give you a bit of insight into how we develop skills right now. I think it's an extremely interesting process. And by the way, I want to give credit to two of my colleagues, Vishal, who's been extremely involved in creating most of the specs, and also setting up the eval framework, which I'm going to talk about in a sec, and also Thomas, who's done a lot of the feedback step, which I'm going to again discuss. But all in order, the current setup is that we have a repo of skills, which are which come co-located with our CLI. A cool thing that our CEO recently added is that now when you run Quick Start, when you create your new SDK, it will prompt you to install those skills in your directory. So the hypothesis is that surfacing this sort of information is that, hey, we have some skills available. Do you want to install them? Will give people more more visibility into this opportunity and help them use it more, which ultimately will lead to better outcomes for them. In terms of our current setup, we are actually migrating away from that right now, which is an interesting thing, and I'll talk to about this in a sec. It's an observation that many of us made in parallel, actually. Some limitations about skills, but so how we came upon our current setup is a lot of analysis of issues that we would have to solve, a lot of I guess first-hand experience at resolving customer issues, and I'll give you some ideas on what could also be used as like sort of initiating sources for skills. Not all of these, we didn't rely on all of these, but just some of the ones that I thought of is like maybe use your like customer support Slack to anonymize and then collect patterns that you can then use. We did not end up doing this, but it's something that we discussed. You can also, this is something that we did do, is scour our own docs and then try to grab key bits of information. You can also take it a step further and look at your analytics and see what docs pages are like most used, and then make an educated guess on, is this going to be something that might be useful as a skill. Human sources, I think that was a key one for us. Talk to our FDEs, talk to just ourselves really, and see what sort of issues we come into contact with on a daily basis, and basically codify those into our skills. And And then we also have this stat, again, is something that we actually ended up not using, but command failure rates from post-hog. So we collect our metrics in post-hog, and our CLI actually shoots off an event on command failure, explaining, what caused the failure. And then we can look into that and sort of diagnose, would this be something that could have been avoided had, the human or agent running this would have had more information, or like, could this be something that we could improve on our end to help future generations? So those would be like sources. In terms of structure, so right now, one of the key issues that we run into is Speakeasy CLI, and especially the whole interaction between the OpenAPI spec and then your SDK, is just a very complex and very large problem space. And so, all in all, you might end up with hundreds, if not thousands, of different skills, right? If you wanted to cover all of it, all of a sudden, you're no longer saving on a ton of context by using skills, because actually you need to involve, a list of like, I don't know, like 2,000, 3,000 distinct skills to solve every single use case. So at that stage, the benefit you get from eventual disclosure, you're just losing it on having to add the metadata into every single prompt, and then that becomes the problem factor. Or even worse, how do you distinguish every single description? How do you make sure that there isn't something that takes precedence on accident from your current, from what would have been the right thing to use? So these flattening these tree structures, because these docs realistically are tree structures, and we are trying to flatten them because skills are flat, is kind of a problem, and it's a bit of a pain point. So the way we use that is Speakeasy agent context, which is our next gen. It's like our step up from skills. And in the future, actually, we should just have one skill, and that one skill will be, if you're an agent using Speakeasy, run Speakeasy agent context to find the bits of information you need for your specific workflow. And what that gets us is two things. One is it gives us an opportunity to really customize that command. So we could be much smarter than just static description. We could be contextual. We could, do text search. We could do anything we want, and that ultimately will empower us to basically, be able to use better docs. But also, one thing that's kind of a pain point right now with skills, if you're developing skills for CLIs, is the drift between the skills version and your CLI's version. And I've seen this in two products, actually. I've developed this tool called Granary, which is kind of like a context management system. It's like a task manager. It's like linear for your agent, right? And we actually released it and open sourced it under Speakeasy as well. So if you want to give it a spin, I definitely recommend you try it out. But with Granary, I had the same problem. I iterated on it quite fast, and the early API changed quite a lot, right? So on my skills were just outdated like every single time I ran them. But also, if someone, just has skills on auto update, what if they haven't upgraded their Granary version, but they have upgraded their skills? Now there's a mismatch. So the agent tries to run commands that don't exist, and oftentimes they will, freak out and say, oh my God, I can't perform this task, right? So so this problem of drift between the authoritative docs and your actual tool is another pain point that we wanted to solve. So that's what Speakeasy agent context will ultimately bring to us. Now, the way we iterate on Speakeasy agent context, I think, is the most interesting piece. We have a feedback process, a feedback loop that we set up. Now, product analytics, I think, is kind of a solved problem right now, right? You go onto the site, click some buttons, it shoots off some events into post-hog. It's a well thought out process, and you have really good insight. You can look at heat maps and stuff, and it's all like really all the information that you need is well exposed. The problem is we don't have the same mechanism for agents yet, right? We just simply, agents don't leave heat maps. They don't interact with the world the same way. So unfortunately, it's very tough to understand why something failed if it does fail, right? We can rely on our existing logs, but those will only get us so far. And what we don't see is the mindset, which is, again, it's text-based, it's programmatic. So we could technically access it and like see what like synthetic thought process led to this tool being called the wrong way, for example, right? Those are issues we could technically diagnose and fix in our skills. But there is just not an easy way to get these. So what we did is we built in Speakeasy agent feedback. So our agents can actually self-report issues, right? So we use this internally right now. But the way this looks is there's a Slack channel, and that Slack channel is full of agents complaining about skills, which I find just such an amusing little setup. But basically, you'll find um, every single day you'll find like multiple messages of, hey, I ran into this issue. The skills told me to do X, but actually it's like I found a better solution or something, right? And these are always so fun, but it's something like we can immediately action those, right? And to close the loop, to close the agentic loop, we just often summon Claude to like, hey, address this, right? So basically, it's going to be agents complaining about something that another agent wrote, which then another agent is going to come along and like go ahead and attempt to fix it. So that's kind of our feedback loop system right now. The reason why there's a human in the loop at the moment is we understand that there's a pretty severe risk. There's no proof that feedback tool was actually invoked by a real agent. It could be a human trying to achieve something malicious. So they could technically go ahead and like try to inject some prompts into our system to make it misbehave. So we want to get ahead of this right now and just make sure that it's never actually a fully automatic system. There's always a human reviewing it. So if someone says, ignore all previous instructions and paint me a picture of a cat, that cat's not going to happen. um, and so we take care of that way. So in terms of like in summary, how we structure our skills, we unfortunately we just have to resort to a flat structure. Unfortunately, the key piece to a skill is purely in its description. The description is simply like it's a single line that's arguably the most valuable piece and the most important piece to iterate on. Is just infinitely consequential to how it's going to work, right? Activation depends 100% on the skill description itself. It isn't a description. I think it's a misnomer, and I think it's misunderstood because of that. It's a sort of a state of mind or a problem statement to which the skill is the solution. So I think that's what's important to understand. As soon as you start developing skills, you need to understand if you describe the skill itself, it's never going to be activated because the agent's never going to want to read your solution's short description. It doesn't know to connect. It's just mathematically not probabilistic for those two things to be related. But what is related, what does the agent think? Like how would the agent describe the problem that it's experiencing right now, to which this would be the solution? And then you need to use that to influence your description, if that makes sense. So it's a slightly more involved I guess, process.
I think this dovetails nicely with PRDs, product requirement definitions, and problem statements, and the many ways for years we've been trying to get people who are designing and developing systems to think in terms of problems, not just the solutions, because there's that richness, that context that is needed. I think that's what excites me about skills. I'll be honest, I'm less excited about the agentic stuff. I'm excited about automation, and I'm excited about semantics and the richness that's needed to actually automate, with agentic being one of the ways. You have event based, you have others, but you need that richness and you need that context, and getting people to do design first, as far as OpenAPI is concerned, has been like
Mhm.
pulling teeth. Getting people to do user stories or PRDs, is hard. And so I think do you see AI as being kind of this helper layer that's going to help us and be our co-pilot or our assistant in doing that work that we weren't always willing to do when it came to design first and Jira and all the other things we've been using for years?
Mm, definitely, I'd say 100%. I'd say you hit the nail right on the head there about design first. I think agentic workflows are proving that design first is the most valuable way of thinking about solving software problems. Um, they are also a large enabler of this sort of workflow. And the reason that is the case is because it seems to me, and a lot of my colleagues are experiencing the same, is that the quality of outcomes with agents scales sort of linearly with the quality of inputs, like garbage in, garbage out, right? We found that to be true, especially for agentic workflows. The more effort you put into your specs, the more effort you put into your design, the better outcomes you should expect out of your execution, your code base, right? And oftentimes nowadays, some products, like I think my tool Granary would be a perfect example of this. I have not written a single line of code of Granary. I've not touched. Actually, not entirely true. I would sometimes go in, um, basically to scratch an itch, but for the 99.99%, it's all written by coding agents. And the idea there is the reason why it could be high quality software and the reason why it works so well is twofold. One, the harnesses, right? A lot of harnesses, a lot of tests, every single issue that ever popped up is now covered with a test suite. So you can just never run into the same problem again. This is this is one of the hallmarks of quality software engineering before agents, right? This is nothing to do with agents. This is just how you were supposed to write software to begin with. But unfortunately, I feel like this is the stuff that we usually, as software engineers, we were like, yeah, but I have a deadline. Am I really going to spend like 2 hours writing a comprehensive test suite? Nowadays, there's just no excuse. It takes like Claude a minute and a half to develop an extremely comprehensive test suite. Obviously, the problem now is that you're going to have to spend your time reviewing it because it still will oftentimes go like assert true equals true. Yay, we've got a pass. Not very useful. So you still need to make sure that these tests are actually testing the right things. But ultimately, I think there are ways around that. Like, for example, like my primary instruction nowadays with when I instruct an agent to set up tests um, is to tell it, write the test, make sure it fails first, then write the implementation. Again, TDD, right? Very simple. We had this concept for years. It's nothing new, but it seems to work really well with agents because it just drills in this like reproduction style workflow that makes sure that the harnesses are always in place and there's less room for error. In terms of spec-driven development, which I think Speakeasy is actually a prime tool to enable, right now, it's so easy to ask an LLM, hey, build my OpenAPI spec. And that becomes a source of truth. You can generate some of your backend. Unfortunately, we don't offer that tool maybe yet. Who knows? I definitely think there's a lot of potential here. But we offer the SDK side. As long as you have a solid tool for your backend generation and you generate your SDK, you're halfway there to a product, right? And all that's left is basically filling in the gaps. The agents are very good at that sort of work, right? When they work within two constraints, when they just need to like go from A to B, they will do a very good job. Generally, when they veer off track and when they produce very unreliable outcomes is when the situation is too vague, right? So when you leave them to think for themselves, I guess is the best way to describe it. Again, I find it super weird that we're talking about computers and thinking, but it's just the world we live in right now. But because spec-driven development allows you to really put constraints on the type of work needing to be done and the execution, I think is super valuable to this sort of workflow. So I love the fact that you mentioned it, by the way. I'm a huge proponent of spec-driven development. And I think we're in the best time ever to be doing this. But yeah, curious about your
Yeah.
thoughts, by the way. So what do you think?
Yeah, I mean I'm design first. I mean, I was in conferences with Jacob and Z, who Z's Superface now, but Jake, they were API and they sold to Oracle, and they kind of set in motion the first API design first kind of way of thinking. And API Blueprint back then was a markdown document. And so this was the early days of Swagger before it became OpenAPI, API Blueprint. And because Swagger was just a config file for Swagger UI and Swagger CodeGen. Like Swagger was not a spec to begin with. And it wasn't until it became OpenAPI that was a spec. And so design first, the API design first, and API, that was kind of it was like amazing moment. And then I worked on the RAML group for MuleSoft, and I seen many other specs come along. OpenAPI kind of came out, and then we got overlays, we got Erazo, we have extensions on OpenAPI, which I know you guys are big, and all of that kind of works in this design first SDK generation, client generation that I spoke of before. And so uh, I wasn't too excited by prompt engineering. I would say context engineering and then spec driven. And now what am I seeing? What's on my timeline this morning? Oh, skills engineering. So skills, this kind of continuity, but also as a whole, context engineering, I'm very interested in. Skills, I'm very interested in. I am worried about the flattening around skills and kind of what we lose, what we've gained with governance and kind of managing resources, and being able to govern resources as a whole, and then managing their, tests and docs and all and code generation from there. But so context engineering and skills is what caught my attention with what you guys are building, and I think it's super exciting. I think you guys are definitely at the forefront of that. So.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and I think I'm gonna make some bets here. See if uh, remind me in a couple weeks. Fortunately, we no longer have to wait years for these bets to pan out, right? Things
It's
happen so
just
fast. Yeah, it's just continuous. So I'm gonna make a very bold bet here and say skills in its current form may not be the final abstraction. I think they need to do at least one thing that is super important for us right now is, again, progressive disclosure, right? Skills are a feature for progressive disclosure. And funnily enough, when you defer to just writing skills for most of your context, they become, by the sheer nature of them having to be around the context all the time, they become less and less effective over time, right? So more skills you have, the less effective they are. And this is just such an unfortunate thing, especially when you find that some skills shadow your other skills. And it's because it's non-deterministic activation, something like you can't say, oh, you touched an OpenAPI spec. Cool. Before you do that, you need to read X, right? There isn't that type of disclosure just yet built into the current tools that we use. I use my own, as some people do. I've built my own little tool called Kernel, and that has this sort of feature. But I think for the future, for skills to make a lot of sense, they either need to do something like progressive discovery, such as like MCP servers do nowadays, where you'd have like a single entry point and then you'd have like a discovery stage where you could find more and more relevant bits of information in a tree structure like we do with Speakeasy agent context, right? That would be one thing. Another thing that could happen is make skills more durable, but also make them like smaller and more fine-grained and have them apply to certain patterns. And you could apply those patterns into like stuff like if certain thing is mentioned in the conversation, right? We then need to 100% load this skill. It could be a rule like if certain file is read before editing, you also need to include this. It's like a comment, but in top of a glob of files, right? Something like this. So I think that system needs to be built out and it needs to be made slightly smarter for skills to truly reach their potential. Right now, they are extremely useful. And in some cases, there was this article from Vassell comparing it to agents.md and how skills underperformed. And we've just so far found that to be categorically untrue, at least with current frontier models. We have proof of that because we have our benchmarks. We have our eval, which my colleague Vishal built, which is kind of like actually programmatically running Claude code. and solving certain problems, and then evaluating the solutions based on certain criteria, checking skill activation, etc., and using those as like a benchmark. And then we can make iterations to our skills with a lot of confidence that we changed X, we ran our evals, and they perform better now. So we have, fewer turns, for example. We have a better quality solution. We have fewer tool failures. All of those could be signals that the skills are now performing better. So we can release a new version knowing that this is going to improve customers' experience with skills. But you need to have some system like this in place, because otherwise each skill update becomes extremely brittle. And the other thing is with skills, they're still honed, and we have this problem right now. They are built on Anthropic's models. We run them with Sonnet and we run them with Opus, and we can make that slight comparison. But really, there's no way of telling, at least in our current setup, how would Codex handle them, right? Would Codex maybe have some quirk that makes it so that it doesn't activate those skills, right? Or it just is averse to using them or something, right? So that's another problem, is you have so many different models and so many viable options, which I think is so fun, is you get to use all these different models, but also it brings kind of a problem to people developing these sort of like add-ons to these tools is, well, you need to test it with every model. What if a new frontier model comes out tomorrow? What if there's a new DeepSeek? What if there's a new Kimi K2? What if there's a Kimi K3 or something, right? It's like all these things could happen tomorrow. And then you're left to like scramble and try to run your evals, make sure that they all know I need to make adjustments. But hold on, if I make this adjustment, how is that going to perform with Anthropic models? What are people still use Opus 3.5? It's like there's just so many variants, and they always cause non-deterministic change that makes this logic, slightly more like psychology, more like software engineering. I find you need to like find the right words, which again is quite an interesting thing.
Which I love that it's AI is touted to replace humans. Humans are messy and unpredictable in a lot of ways, and AI is supposed to kind of fix that, but it's introducing some new messiness, fixing some, introducing new messiness, and now we got this beautiful mess of humans and AI all working together. But I like your vision of skills. I think it's very pragmatic. I'm in a similar state. I mean, before I started doing the startup I'm doing now, I have APIs.io, which is an API search engine we launched back in 2014. A startup that I was building it with got bought by Red Hat and then got bought by IBM. So I kind of lost the domain for a while. And then we got it back. And I was going to build this API search engine. And I have thousands of APIs. So I have a GitHub org with thousands of repos. Each API Stripe has its own repo, and it's got a index file. And then I've broken up. Stripe's a pretty big open API, so you got to break it up by invoicing by kind of by the tags. And so I have thousands of repos like that, and I can crawl back and check all those out, crawl them, and I can produce skills up, the wazoo, like any skills, any combo, and you start without any context or business reason or capability, it becomes ineffective. Like, so I can do that for OpenAPI, I can do that for MCP, I can do it for skills, but you got to have that business reason and that context. And I think your guys' skills in the SDK realm are you're poised at especially what you're doing with context, and you're kind of poised at life cycle, that I think you guys are poised pretty well to understand this sprawling chaotic mess that's getting. We have all these files, all spec driven doesn't mean you got one spec and you just kind of go through it. It's like it could be a whole mess. But I think you guys are really poised to kind of try to make sense of that, and hopefully bring some order. But like you said, I saw that in your guys' skills. Like you guys, this will work across these models and these clients, and you guys, as a service provider, you try to do that, but that's got to be hard. I mean, I'm building a VS Code extension right now, and I'm like, no, we got to be focusing on Copilot. No, wait, we got to focus on Claude Code. No, wait, no, So, I think you guys are doing well. So,
Yeah, thank you. And yes, admittedly, it's a lot of, I guess, a lot of dog fooding as well. I think one thing that really helps us is we use these on a day-to-day basis too, right?
mhm.
I think I had this statement on LinkedIn, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago. If your tool can't build itself, is it really a tool? It's kind of like a weird. I know it's like a bit of an abstract statement, but the idea is that if you're building dev tools and you're not using those dev tools, what are you even doing, right? If you don't find your own tools good enough for you to incorporate them in your day-to-day um, software development lifecycle, how good are they really? And I think every dev tool company should be basically using and abusing their own tools constantly to no end. A good example of this is for us, we use our SDK generation more than we should really. Like our entire backend is driven by SDK generation and our front end as well. But interestingly, like we do this thing where we generate the Go SDK and our backend is written in Go, and then we use those types that we generate for our backend types, right? So we know that there's parity. Not again, like this is the abusing part, right? Where we kind of like, there is a gap clearly. They should be like backend types, but no, we don't offer that right now. But we can generate our Go SDK and then we can use that as our backend, which I think is like a fun little use case. And then obviously we use our TypeScript SDK for consuming that backend. And similarly, our Gram team, Gram's our MCP product. Our Gram team uses the same sort of setup, right? So we prove on a day-to-day basis that our products work well. But also it gives us a lot of insight into how our product's doing really. So like, for example, if there's, I think SDK generation itself is just such a complicated problem space. There's just so many moving parts, especially because OpenAPI, frankly, just wasn't designed for SDK generation, right? So we are realistically, we are trying to kind of fit some solution around a problem that isn't entirely meant for this solution. So with that said, obviously, I think we're doing quite well. Like we have some quite good processes, but also we have some hard edges, and it's cool to find these out ourselves because we're using them to such an extent. We can often see, oh wait, hold on, there's like this very rarely bugs, but oftentimes you'll find stuff like, oh, okay, this type is a bit off. Like this, I think we could do a better job at naming this. Or like, I upgraded to a new version and there's a lot of files changed, but they're only like comments. And like, do we really need these changes? Like, could we just get away with like not making these, unnecessary changes to our SDKs? Even though they might be useful, but you always have to weigh in. Like, is it gonna benefit enough for you to warrant all these like lines of code that you now need to review, etc., etc. So I think that's something that really helps us um, prove our products is just the overuse of them, really. And I think this extends to basically everything and every software tooling company, especially. You see nowadays, like I can't imagine, working for Anthropic but not using Claude Code on a day-to-day basis to build Claude Code, right? It's just like it makes no sense. When I'm building I've got my own like agentic environment because I have this specific workflow that I don't think any tool fits right now. And again, it's like very spec driven. It's like very design oriented, right? And these tools right now, they are very good at like you directing the agent to do a certain task, but they are not well suited for building out like a whole feature set or like a something very large and like all encompassing. They don't have a good way of like directing like a swarm of agents, right? Which is I think is going to be the next stage of software engineering. We'll just like all be conductors in like this massive orchestra of millions of different agents. Let's say not millions, because I think that's going to drown the earth in terms of electricity use. But let's say like hundreds of like small agents running, and we'll just be the conductors, like listening to the music. I think that's coming. And I'm building kind of like an interface for that. And I'm just using the tool itself. Like the first thing I've implemented is for it to be able to iterate on itself, right? And I just let it go. And so I'm like, okay, these are the features I want to build, press enter, and I see it like update itself in real time. I think that's just such a weird, such an alien feeling. You never used to get your software being able to update itself in real time. That's just such an interesting space. So yeah, definitely. Um,
Yeah. So I mean, on the real quick one, we have a guest, David, my friend's in the chat there. I see you, David. I've been so engaged in the conversation. I'm not normally I'm talking to folks in the theme, but if you have any questions, David, let me know. I turned on the chat just so in case you have any, or raise your hand. You talk about eating dog food, and I'm literally going to be using your guys' as one of the reasons I wrote the story is I'm going to use you guys as a reference and ping all your competition and other service providers and go, hey, do you guys have the same thing? Do you have this set of skills in a repo that's easy to understand? Because you guys kind of set a bar. And one of my pet peeves, as I said earlier, with all the API service providers is I could always tell the API service providers from 2010 through 2020 who were just coming for an exit. They weren't coming to build solutions or tools because they rarely had an API, meaning they weren't eating their own dog food, practicing what they preach. And I could always spot them and go, those guys are going to be, acquired, acqui-hired, or go out of business within 2 or 3 years, and they're going to go away. They're not building for the space. And so you guys kind of, eating your own dog food, drinking your champagne, put open sourcing your tool. But I also know there's a lot of enterprises who are very concerned with sharing their open API, let alone their skills and their overlays. So can you talk to me about any thinking that goes into like what skills do you guys keep behind the scenes? What do you put out there? How do you guys approach that?
mhm. Yeah, so one thing that's super important to us is to make sure that no customer information gets actually leaked into the skills. Oftentimes we'll know from reading the skill, we will know, okay, there is a customer who would have this issue multiple times, and we would be able to associate it. But if you're looking at it from the outside, there's just no way for you to really tell, okay, this is going to be X, or this is going to be Y. We are very intentional about making sure that it's fully anonymous, and we're not describing issues. We are describing a certain pattern which can then be solved in a certain way. We're not saying, the company X's SDK looks like this, solve it, right? It's got to be very general so that the patterns are understandable, but also the solutions can be applied to all code bases, right? So there's no real risk of privacy here. One thing that I can imagine some company might do is they might roll their own skills based on our skills, right? So that there could be some play where they would go ahead and say, oh, these are cool skills. Hey, Claude, can we seem to have, this is our specific use case. Can you customize these skills for us? That could be something that they could do. But again, they would own all of it. And the reason why we open sourced our skills is that you can do that, right? You can customize it to your own heart's desires. There's no like proprietary information here, even though the skills themselves are sourced from like a vast database of like thousands and thousands of real specs and like thousands, even hundreds and hundreds of thousands of real customer issues. Um, they are always generic enough so that they will solve a problem, and then you can go ahead and customize it to your heart's content.
Yeah, you guys kind of have come up with this distillation process, like, making whiskey or some, fine grain alcohol. You kind of distill all this down into this little, goodness that you can consume and use, and it's generalized. David said, organizing governing skills access control is analogous to API access, meaning private, partner, public, and lessons learned from API DX also applies to MCP and skill DX, discovery, catalogs, descriptions, metadata, and I would add registries and other things. So yeah, I think that there's going to be a lot of work. But back to what I was saying about APIs.io, David, is I've been in the API discovery game for so long, and I worked at Programmable Web, and I helped build the Postman network, and I just don't think catalogs or central discovery is the way forward. Not that they shouldn't exist or they're not needed, but I feel like and talking to you today, like I feel like things are more ephemeral. We just kind of have to roll with what is happening and come up with these kind of ephemeral ways of gathering and accumulating context and then dissipating it. And but like you said, test it and benchmark it so that we can evolve and understand the value and move in the right direction.
Yes. Docs, I think the way I would put it is, for so long, docs were kind of an afterthought and sort of like a necessary evil to having your own APIs, you having your own software product, you often had to just give docs, right? And you often were like, okay, how do I generate this? How do I go through the
Yeah.
least effort to
Yeah.
make this a reality? Now it's the opposite. Now your docs are paramount to anyone integrating with your product because they will let their coding agent roam free. And the coding agent was going to pick up your docs and is going to go, okay, well, this is too generic for me to really help, right? Implementing something. Uh,
Yeah.
so whoever wants to win in this space has to basically um, turn their docs into something that's constantly living and evolving with the product. Not only with the product, but like their evolving customer base. Because for us, like we, always get new customers and they often bring their own like very specific, very unique problems. But that doesn't actually mean that no one else has those problems. It's very it's safe to assume that someone else might have the same problem as Google does, or like some big company. The idea is that in seeing these problems and having a chance to resolve them and distill it into docs and distill it into a docs product that is now generally available to all agents, we are very likely to solve that same problem moving forward for a lot of our maybe potential future customers, right? I think that's the big takeaway there.
David says marketing teams have learned how to use search engine optimization for years, but unless your API skills tech has marketing, few will push it into the registry analogy of SEO. Yeah, the SEO thing is another. I want to back park parking lot that because SEO, LLMEO, I'm doing some tests.